Well, welcome everyone to today's presentation, Connecting Data Through Every Phase of the Project Lifecycle. My name is Chuck Meese with Autodesk. I am on the Autodesk Global Business Development team, and my team focuses on working around ecosystems of projects, trying to understand who all of the players are and connecting the dots. So the concept of connecting data through every phase of a project lifecycle is something that's very near and dear to the work that my team does. I'd also like to welcome you on behalf of Autodesk Construction Solutions, where at Autodesk Construction Solutions, we like to ask you, what is your new possible? And we believe that one part of that new possible is working with integration partners, such as we'll be joined by today, to accelerate the value of your technology deployments. Today, we're joined by partners IntelliWave and O3 Solutions. We're joined by these partners to help you understand data in the context of some common construction problems around materials management and work packaging. These two partners have integrations, and we're going to speak to them today about how these integrations enable information to flow in a project and unlock productivity. So let's get to our guests. Barry and Josh, if you could tell me a little bit about your company and then a little bit about yourselves. Barry, we'll start with you.
Sounds good. Thanks, Chuck. Excited to be here. Barry Payton. I handle business development and strategic partnership here at IntelliWave. Our product is called SiteSense. SiteSense is a cloud and web-based application with mobile application support, really focused on four key areas of construction: materials and inventory management, topic of discussion today; track and trace with IoT and progressing support; tools and equipment management; and then also materials and equipment planning. I myself have been in construction tech for about 9 years, calling in from Edmonton, Alberta, Canada today. About myself, I have a 1-year-old daughter, which keeps me really busy these days. So, yeah,
Excellent.
that's pretty crazy having a little one running around. So.
Excellent. And Josh, how about you?
Sure. So Josh Gerben, CEO of O3 and co-founder. O3 is the leading provider of advanced work packaging, or AWP software. Advanced work packaging, or AWP, is a project execution methodology that was developed in the industrial construction industry, and it's recognized as an industry best practice by the Construction Industry Institute. That process has been around for the better part of a decade, but it is continuing to advance and expand to encompass all aspects of project execution. And O3 has been a meaningful part of that, of advancing the art of AWP maturity. We support 10 work package types out of the box for all the project phases: front-end planning, detailed design, construction, and commissioning and startup. And in addition to supporting more packages throughout the entire project lifecycle, we have a fundamentally different approach to delivering advanced work packaging or work package management on projects, which is really that we're not just about scoping the packages and then tracking their progress and status. While O3 offers those capabilities, what sets O3 apart is the approach towards package management. So we're designed from the ground up to actively manage those packages and all of their associated activities through a configurable workflow. And it's that collaborative environment for task management that's a real differentiator in terms of O3 solutions. We're also a little different in terms of our modernness of the solutions. So we're not an antiquated provider that was developed in the early 2000s. It's a modern platform. It's a SaaS solution, and it leverages that interconnected data throughout the entire project lifecycle, which we're excited to talk about here today. In terms of myself, mechanical engineer by training, serial entrepreneur by practice. Started my first company in college, leveraging RFID technology for cashless payments. Raised some venture capital, secured a number of critical patents, and eventually was acquired. After that company, I returned to Princeton, completed my degree in mechanical engineering, and then went on to do venture capital for a bit, but ultimately found myself wanting to get back into entrepreneurship and joined a company called Atlas RFID Solutions that's focused on the materials management space. And that's actually where I met Barry and the rest of the IntelliWave team. We were competitors at the time in the track and trace world. Now that moved on, now we're partners. But after helping grow that company, we grew it by about 200 times its original size in a few years. Left with some colleagues to found O3. Really surprised by the lack of solutions focused on advanced work packaging. We believe advanced work packaging is the new project execution methodology. And so O3 is the first solution to be built from the ground up to say, hey, let's have a project management solution that's built around AWP and AWP workflows specifically. So part of that, as we'll talk about today, is that ability to consume and leverage an interconnected data set, because advanced work packaging does go across that entire project lifecycle and does require the connection of data throughout that entire project lifecycle.
Excellent. So for the audience, our discussion today is going to be interactive. I'm going to be asking Josh and Barry some questions about their integrations, why they chose the Autodesk Construction Cloud. We want to invite you to participate in this conversation through the comments panel. So as we're going through today, if there are comments, if there's questions you'd like to have our presenters address, go ahead and put those in the comments panel. So when I look down, that means I'm reading your comments, so don't think I'm ignoring you. But let's go ahead, and the first question that I want to start with is, our topic today, Josh, is this idea of focus on connected data through every phase of the project lifecycle. Tell me why that's important topic in your eyes, and why is that important to O3?
Yeah, so I touched on this a little bit, but O3 was designed from the beginning to provide this single connected data structure for work package management across all stakeholders and throughout that entire project lifecycle. And that's a core value proposition of the O3 approach to AWP-driven project management. So from O3's perspective, this is important because true AWP is not possible without it. So advanced work packaging is not a construction execution methodology. AWP is a project execution methodology. So that means that true AWP requires this interconnected data throughout the entire project lifecycle from concept to commissioning. And really O3 is the first solution that was developed with this framework to support full AWP adoption across the lifecycle. The ability to readily consume and translate and store and leverage and share all of this interconnected data is what enables this full AWP. So there's a lot of investment that O3's done around data management capabilities to support that, our ability to configure the tool to be aware of other systems that are at play on the project and what data is expected from those systems in terms of the data requirements and fields, format, and frequency for those data sources. And then the ability to track the data expectations against the actual data delivery allows us to raise a flag and understand when we don't have the data necessary to support efficient execution. So that's one critical piece from our perspective, is we have to consume a lot of data and be part of this interconnected data system. But the reality is O3 is not the last stop for a lot of the data that we collect or even create throughout the project lifecycle. Right? We have to pass data back to these other solutions like P6 or the materials management solution, document management systems, and project control solutions. So it's not just the ability to consume this data from these other systems, but also the ability to share the data back to those systems. That's a really important part to having a full holistic AWP and work package management solution. And from O3's perspective, one of the things that we found in integrating with other tools in the market is a lot of the legacy solutions that were developed before the age of software as a service or web delivered software. They often have APIs, but those are typically an afterthought, designed mostly to get data into the database of that system. Whereas O3 is a more modern solution where the user interface itself of the application uses the API, which means that all of the data that you can access inside of O3 can be readily moved in and out through real-time bidirectional integrations. It's not a limited subset of the data that you can move, which I think is really important for supporting an interconnected data environment. But at the end of the day, when we say, well, interconnected data is important to us, what does that really mean? What that means is that we don't want to have to enter the data multiple times in multiple systems throughout the project lifecycle. Because at the end of the day, you need all of this data to be able to do the project. You're going to enter this information. But if you're able to get that information earlier and then reuse it, you get more value out of it and you reduce the cost of entering that. So, examples of that are really common in the O3 world would be engineering data model attribution. If you increase your investment in the attribution of your engineering data model, then when you bring that into a tool like O3 to create your virtual construction model, you get a whole bunch of automation that results from that. So for example, if I start to scope a package and I pull in some components, I can automatically create execution tasks and approvals and other things that are necessary for that. So I can significantly reduce the amount of effort necessary to create and scope packages, making your workface planners as much as 500% more efficient. So the value of interconnected data is there from an execution perspective through automation and reduction of the redundant entry. You have a lot of savings. And then you also, you get into the value of having interconnected data from a reporting perspective. Now there's importance to having rear-facing tools that will do reporting against data warehouses and things like that, a BI solution. O3 doesn't compete with those tools. Where O3 gets into the reporting game is around reports that help you to execute the project. So when it comes to the ability to manage by exception and to be able to make decisions and take action, that's where the O3 value comes in from a reporting perspective, and having access to interconnected data. So data that isn't even necessarily authored in O3, but being able to pull some of that data in to provide better context is really important as well. So from an O3 perspective, AWP is not possible without interconnected data. True automation is not possible without interconnected data. So it's critical to AWP and critical to O3 strategy.
So Josh, it'd be safe to say you see it as a fundamental or foundational constraint to everything that you do at O3.
Absolutely.
Barry, let's turn to you. What are your thoughts on this whole idea of interconnected data?
Yeah, for sure. Thanks, Chuck. And yeah, just to kind of circle back with what Josh kind of mentioned at the beginning there. I think everybody is generally aware that the E&C industry, for example, there's a lot of different reports and things out there. One that comes to mind is really the FMI Big Data report from a couple of years ago that really talked about really the concept of unused data that goes, in this industry, for example, right? So I think around 96% of data goes unused on average, and the other component to that is about 13% of work hours are spent really looking for data in a lot of cases. So if we talk about how solutions like SiteSense and Autodesk Construction Solutions, O3, et cetera, how they can be connected across the various areas of the project lifecycle. Kind of like Josh mentioned as well, right? Having all of these systems kind of interconnected in an ecosystem essentially allows you to really leverage that information a lot easier versus kind of more manual based methods or collating reporting based on maybe more standard solutions like maybe manual paper based or Excel or things like that. So in the availability of APIs and data in today's day and age, you're kidding yourself if you don't take advantage of the ability to leverage that data to enhance your project execution strategies. And where SiteSense comes into the mix there, is really from the ability to pull in things like engineering data, for example, to assist with the material and equipment planning piece, forecasting availability based on inventory, order shortages, on-hand shortages, those types of things. So even pre-procurement, trying to identify some of those high-level material constraints, and then focusing on actually, the construction piece as well, getting into the next phase, essentially being able to take that data and be able to identify upcoming requirements on your schedule, and then being able to request, issue, and actually install from that perspective, and then taking that in additional data from there and moving it into even the operations, commissioning, and maintenance phase as well. So we're seeing customers really leveraging, pretty much the entire life cycle that I described there. And from that perspective, it does take multiple systems within the ecosystem to be connected to make that a reality, right? So.
Well, I want to drill in a little bit on something. You both have used an interesting word, and that word is ecosystem, right? At one point in time, my team was actually called Ecosystem Business Development, so that's what we focus on. So Josh and Barry, let's start with you, Josh. Tell me what ecosystem means to you, right? Like in your work, who are the players in that ecosystem, and how do you think that works? And Barry, I'll ask you to define the same thing from a materials management perspective.
Yeah, so from an AWP perspective, right, it's a project execution methodology that goes across the entire life cycle. So really true AWP is project execution, and you're connecting into a lot of the tools. You're connecting into the engineering tools, you're connecting into the drawing management, document management tools, you're connecting into materials management tools, procurement tools, vendor document management tools. Most of the tools on a project are used in some form of execution, and they have constraints that relate to various packages. So when we talk about the ecosystem of the project, we're talking about all the tools inside that landscape, which is often the majority of the project execution tools with which we're integrated. The The other thing to think about when we think about ecosystems is sometimes organizations or companies like to think of their tool as or their tool set as an ecosystem. And where that comes into play is where you have providers that sell both things, for example, like engineering authoring tools as well as workplace planning tools. And what we find is oftentimes those tools work reasonably well when you have a model that's engineered inside of the same ecosystem or the same system provided by that same solution provider. But when you get outside of that, or if you get into the real world where projects in reality, you have lots of different models that are engineered by different authoring tools, by different groups. And so you need a solution that allows you to consume from outside of that ecosystem provider, that one individual provider. And that's one of the things that, and I'll talk about this later when we get to this more directly, but that's one of the things where working with Autodesk and being able to leverage the Forge viewer has been really valuable to O3, because we can consume models engineered in any authoring tool and leverage them for the virtual construction model. We're not limited just to one small subset of models that are engineered inside of a tool that's made by the same provider. So when we talk about ecosystem, we generally mean all of the tools on side of a project, but we do use those to also refer to ecosystems of a provider, like you mentioned, Chuck.
Barry, any other thoughts from your end?
Yeah, just in summary, to build on what Josh has said there, I think, when we talk about ecosystem, we're looking at sources of data, and it depends on kind of where the data originates as well. We have customers that we connect in with, like ERP accounting, construction management solutions on the market, and from that perspective, in some cases, we even become essentially the solution for material requisition in the field, pushing back to an ERP accounting or construction management tool in that case as well, right? So from that perspective, when we talk about integrations and how we can connect your ecosystem of tools together, there's also the core tool set, in this case, maybe like an ACC, for example, followed up by a field tool like SiteSense, for example, backed up by maybe solutions like O3, for example, on the AWP side, for example, or work packaging. So I think when we talk about the ecosystem of tools, there is various different user groups that are playing together here, that the data being shared between those solutions just means more benefit of that availability of data. Because like I said, right, I mean, taking 13% of your working hours trying to actually find the information that you need to make more informed decisions from a proactive nature is really, beneficial for you to get that information quickly, right?
Excellent, Barry. Thank you for the follow-up. And it was interesting that you both used the same word, and I just wanted to drill in a little bit on that. Barry, you said something, and it even pulled up some comments in the chat panel about 96% of the data isn't used.
Yep.
So I'd love to start with what are your thoughts on some of the challenges that you've seen managing that information, and why is 96% of the data not being used on these projects?
So, yeah, no, great question, Chuck. And I mean, it's kind of a staggering number, obviously, right? Like we think of, data and, Excel files and systems and homegrown solutions, but now we're talking more about the construction solutions, which are more, cloud-based in nature, right? Or, from that perspective, availability of data has become a lot better. But I'll throw out a couple more stats at you from that same report from FMI. So, from that perspective, they say on average about 30% of ENC companies have applications that don't integrate. So that leads into the 96% of data that does not get used. And in general, 8% of ENC firms only have the ability to report on dashboard and, on information in real time. If you think about that from a perspective of making critical decisions, especially from SiteSense's perspective, when we talk about supply chain, materials management, et cetera, critical information like that in a supply chain struggling world, especially based on the end of the pandemic here, and how lead times really affected those types of things. From that perspective, if you're making decisions based on collated data from a manual perspective, that is even 24, 48 hours old, even older than that, for example, that might actually have a profound effect on your schedule and even a budgetary effect as well, right? So from that perspective, we're talking about all these different folks out there that are trying to understand, how do I get all my systems connected. From that perspective, if you're talking engineering, procurement, supply chain, material management, workplace planning, or advanced work packaging, that whole ecosystem of tools, like I keep saying, is basically the effort of you being able to report in real time on that data. Because from that perspective, if you're not essentially able to glean that information and make more informed decisions about your project execution, then you're going to be left behind, kind of thing, right, in that regard, right? And you're going to have some reactionary situations, which reactive versus proactive. Reactive is always going to have a much more profound effect on the schedule and budget of your project.
Excellent. Josh, what are your thoughts?
Yeah, so when it comes to managing, challenges for managing information or data on a project, could talk about that for a while. I guess the biggest challenge that we see is not getting the right data, early enough in the project. So not building the data requirements into bid packages and contracts makes the sharing of that data more difficult. I was on a panel and there was I won't say who, but we were talking with a CTO of a major contractor, and the way that he put it was, in today's environment, the approach to project execution is adversarial, which means that providing data is often seen as a risk, that it can support the other side's argument around claims or change orders or issues. So you don't want to load the other side's gun, as in fact, I think is the way that he put that. And so we have, now if you want to get data moving between people, if you don't have a collaborative, integrated project delivery approach, which is not as common, it's often comes down to that contractual data requirement. So getting that defined and built into not only your contracts, but the invitation to tender, I think is critical. And so as members of the A2P community, we've been actively supporting CI's efforts around standardizing the data requirements. And we've released that from a CI perspective, and we need owners to really start pushing that, and contractors, EPCs, pushing that with their suppliers. So that's the first step, is kind of defining that, but then getting people to actually value an organization's ability to deliver data is critical. Right now, one of the things we see is owners have taken the step of mandating AWP philosophy and mandating AWP data requirements in their bid package. But that doesn't mean that when they then receive those bids, that procurement is going to appropriately value that and not just make the decision based off of the lowest perceived cost or the lowest cost that they're projecting before the project's executed. So we need people to, from an owner's perspective, to value these investments and reward contractors that are making those investments, both in AWP, but then also in the interconnected data environment, and meeting those data requirements. Saying you want it, but not actually valuing it's not going to drive the change. Outside of kind of the general availability of data comment, one challenge that we run into is the interoperability between multiple systems. So if they may or may not be integrated, but even if you do integrate those, we often see that the references between the systems are different. So Barry knows this well from the materials management world. The way that the model or engineering system refers to a component may be different than the procurement system, which can be different than the materials management system, right? So there's all these different ways that people refer to that. And that makes it really challenging to have accurate kind of material visibility data. This problem isn't limited materials, but it's one that both Barry and I know well and have suffered through. And so having that ability to either manage that discrepancy in references in the tool, which takes building a lot of that into the solution, which is one thing that O3 has done. But the better way to solve that is to clean up those data issues at the source. So you really have to work with your clients and try to address that as they move through the ADP maturity journey, and see the value of some of that, moving some of that investment earlier. By aligning those things earlier in the project, you can reap rewards downstream. And so that's something that we like to work with people on. The other, another common challenge that we see is, there's a lack of, sufficiently granular data for certain disciplines. So it's, doing construction automation or workplace planning around a discipline such as piping is fairly straightforward, right? You can consume an engineering model that has information on the pipe but isn't broken down into spools, and then you can consume fabrication data, and then you can build a virtual construction model that has a physical representation of that spool. And thinks of that as spool as a component and no longer just as a pipe run, which is really critical when you're actually building packages to execute in the field. That's not true in all disciplines. Civil is an example where you often need more granular data to be able to drive that automation. So that's another kind of data creation change that you have to move earlier in the project. Now, at the end of the day, how you're going to build that, how you're going to break down the frame, the form work, and how you're going to do that civil work has to be decided. Those decisions have to be made. Right? But if you have some of that information earlier in a data format, you can leverage that for some automation. So there's some changes that need to happen on how you kind of define your process and what level of granularity you go to that we see. And then I mentioned this previously, we also see this challenge around insular systems, right? So there are a number of providers in this space who refer to themselves as platform providers, but really what they've done is gone up and purchased a couple of different solutions and then jammed them together. And then those solutions don't necessarily interoperate or play well with other tool sets. And that's one of the things we like about the Autodesk Forge viewer. And one of the reasons we selected is it allows that best in breed approach where, Autodesk being a platform company and O3 being a platform company, we see it as, hey, you can select the best AWP solution, you can select the best materials management solution, you can select the best document management solution, right? You can build all these tools and have all of these working together. And that allows that best in breed without sacrificing interoperability because they all are modern and willing to kind of share data back and forth between them. So I think that's another kind of challenge we see is that some of the solutions are more insular and don't play well in an interconnected environment, and that's a challenge. And then the final one that I'll mention, which is an interesting one, it's a good challenge, is that once you have this interconnected data environment, now you have a new challenge you didn't have before, which is controlling access to that information.
Yeah.
Right? In an old world way, the way that we controlled this was you would release drawings and then you would physically distribute those drawings to someone else. And so they didn't see into your system. They didn't have access to the data. There's no way that they could accidentally see a version of the drawing that wasn't ready for release because there was a physical step of kind of issuing that. Well, in a more modern approach that's data-centric as opposed to document-centric, now you need controls in place to be able to manage the different contracts you find on a project and the different times at which or statuses of various entities that determine what access people should have. So once you have an interconnected environment, you have a new challenge, which is a good challenge of, okay, now I have to have more granular control over the access to the information. So that's a good problem to have and one that allows you, if you handle it correctly, to have thousands of users from hundreds of different companies collaborating together in a single interface, the way that O3 supports and powered by our integrations with Autodesk supports on some of the largest projects in the world.
Great. That really good context. A couple things I pulled out of that. Josh used the term CII. I'll define that for the group. That's the Construction Industry Institute, an industry organization Josh and I are both very, very involved in. We tend to use acronyms a lot in our conversations. I wanted to define that one. Barry, I picked something up, and I'd like to go back to you on that. Right? We're living through, and we're just coming out. We hopefully just coming out of the back of a pandemic.
Yep.
Pandemic has really changed the way that we have to collaborate. I think we all understand that. How has that affected both of your companies in a really brief description?
Yeah, for sure. I think, I mean, obviously, it's been challenging for the world to kind of adjust from the office, the site-based environment, to more of a virtual environment, which is actually more of a reason to have more accessibility to data, which is more of a reason to have more, cloud-based solutions, for example, where you're not necessarily relying on like your filing cabinet by your desk at the construction site, for example, for information, right? So we've seen a really big uptick in construction and engineering companies really taking the initiative around how do we try to connect these systems together to allow for for example the interoperability like Josh mentioned of all these different solutions together and really the from that perspective that's part of the reason we built the integration with ACC or Autodesk Construction Cloud is the industry was asking for it essentially based on some of these challenges. From that perspective, we've got the field folks in utilizing SiteSense. We've got the core solution from ACC. From that perspective, availability of data between the solutions. Yes, they're both cloud based, but you might not have folks that are connected across the various different levels of your construction team, right? So that's also connecting back to the corporate office and folks working from home and virtual and those types of things, right? So yeah, it's been a really big uptick, I think, in folks trying to solve that accessibility of that unused data that I talked about, right?
Josh, thoughts from you?
Yeah, I mean, I think the pandemic has accelerated this digitalization journey, and we saw particularly in the beginning where access to the sites were limited to critical personnel only projects that were using a web-based solution like O3 were able to move forward. Projects that required fixed clients, required you to be on site, they were interrupted. So I think our industry's been a little bit slower to embrace SaaS, but I think everyone now sees, okay, this is the future. We need to get on board.
Okay. Josh, I want to drill in on something you've said a couple times. You've talked about the role of the Autodesk Construction Cloud in facilitating this flow of information. You've talked about why you've chosen to integrate on that. Can you go in a little bit deeper? And then Barry, I'll ask you to follow up on similar thoughts. What's been the role of the Autodesk Construction Cloud in facilitating this transfer of data?
Absolutely. So just for context, O3 primarily leverages two components of ACC, or Autodesk Construction Cloud. That's Autodesk Docs and the Forge viewer. So we use Autodesk Docs for organizing and managing documents and their associated data. That's really important to O3. We do not position ourselves as a document management system. We integrate with those tools, and first and foremost, we have an integration with Autodesk Suite, which we bring with us, and is an automated integration already in place with all of our implementations. We leverage the Autodesk Docs for storing the model files, and then we display those integrated inside of O3 in the Forge viewer. So it's an integrated experience within the O3 tool. And so while we use the Autodesk Docs to store the model files and to view them within the Forge within O3, we're scraping the data off of those model files and then building our own construction components within O3 and scraping data from other systems like fabrication data. So this is allowing us to interconnect those data sets from, we have model files, we have engineering lists, we have fabrication data. So we're being able to pull those into one place. And so that ability to consume that data from multiple locations and combine it together, that gets rid of some of the old kind of end-to-end run manual approach or excessive model conditioning that legacy solutions require. It's a more modern, interconnected approach. And then the other area where we leverage the Autodesk solution set, which was not anticipated, is really around consuming a bunch of the non-graphical data. So we knew the model files would be an important piece. But a lot of our clients were so pleased with the ease with which that they could dump files into Autodesk Docs and have them automatically consumed and parsed into O3 that they discovered that use case on their own. So bringing in additional non-graphical data into O3. So that's kind of one that we didn't anticipate, but it's become a very easy way for us to consume data into the tool, where we can connect, particularly when we're trying to get out of document-centric data. That document-centric data can be dumped into Autodesk Docs, and then we're able to consume that in an automated fashion and update that information and keep those in sync, which is pretty powerful. And then I'd say the other thing that we've done there on an interconnected data set side is that the Autodesk Docs tool has become a work in progress document management tool for some of our clients. So one of the things that O3 does is it allows you to consume these documents. It could be vendor drawings, for example, and then you can do markups. And then that automatically creates constraints and things within the tool that need to be managed within the tool. But previous to the use of Autodesk Docs and O3 in that process, there's a really convoluted back and forth with 5 or 6 different document management systems and lots of spreadsheets for tracking the files and the actions. But now the users can access all that information in O3, and behind the scenes, Autodesk Docs is the work in progress document management system that's powering that. So without adding a 6th document management system to this project, we were able to provide a real solution that. So we sort of snuck a document management system in behind the scenes to solve that problem. But it's been really powerful and a use case that's really taken off with our client base.
Barry, how about you?
Yeah, for sure. So, I mean, just building on what Josh mentioned there, I think really the Autodesk Construction Cloud being the central hub or the core solution for our mutual customers, being able to, essentially have that, solution really drive, process, whether it be from engineering to procurement to construction, even into the commissioning and operations phase of your project. I mean, from that perspective, our tool really fits in on the field capture of data, and we touch on really the document module, the cost module, and the assets module as well. So documents for pulling in information for engineering and forecast, so being able to look at material constraints, even pre-procurement, like I mentioned. So being able to identify that early and in a proactive fashion versus kind of finding out the week before you need something on your schedule, for example. And then also being able to tie into the cost module, being able to close the loop on the vendor payment side from the procure to pay side. So being able to actually have PO delivery verification and actually close that loop, and then being able to actually have asset management as well. So on the asset side, having things like custom workflows or progressing statuses, milestones, inventory statusing, for example, being synced back to, for example, the ACC side. Ultimately being able to provide that project execution reporting that today would be more of a more manual based, or maybe there's communication between the groups, the field teams and the corporate office, for example, to really get that information. Now essentially we're basically connecting the two systems together to basically be able to make that more streamlined process overall.
Excellent. So, Barry, in your conversation, I heard you talk about integration with assets, integration with cost. There's a lot of platforms out there. You had your choice of which one to integrate with. What made you choose the Autodesk Construction Cloud?
For sure, yeah, and I mean, it's really simple actually. I think the availability, of the APIs and the how easy they are to work with. It really saved our development team a lot of time and effort, essentially standing that up and standing that integration up, and really makes it super easy for us to react to customer feedback as well. So if a customer is looking for an additional integration touch point or something like that, it's pretty easy for us to go ahead and react and provide that additional integration for them as well. So I think really the availability of the APIs saved us some time, and then also the industry was really asking for it. We had a lot of mutual customers that are really asked us to really look at connecting these two platforms together, SiteSense and ACC, to really try and solve some of this interoperability issue that I think Josh mentioned as well previously. And the second thing I would just say, the support from the partner team. The partner team at Autodesk has been really great to work with, and has really provided these types of opportunities to really work together as partners, and really provided the platform for us to really get the message out about the integration and the value for our mutual customers.
Excellent. Josh, how about you?
Yeah, the single most important factor, I think, is from a technical perspective of the Forge viewer being able to support models that were built in any engineering authoring tool. That's really critical for us. A lot of the legacy providers in the workplace planning space will tell you that their stack plays well with others, but the reality is that's just not true. And what we find on modern projects today, with a number of different collaborators and project stakeholders and joint ventures, is that we get a number of authoring tools on any project. So the ability to consume models from multiple authoring tools and leverage them together in one platform is critical, and the Forge viewer has been really instrumental in enabling us to do that. And then the other piece that I would say, and I think Barry touched on this, but the ease of integration, the robustness of the APIs, the fact that it's a modern SaaS tool, there's existing example documentation and support resources, and existing community access to developers and developer boot camps, and just it's clear that Autodesk wants to be a modern platform solution provider, and they've invested in the resources to support that, which includes the partner resources that O3 leverages. So we at the end of the day, Autodesk is a modern solution, and that approach aligns really well with our view of what the industry needs, and what is necessary to disrupt what has been a pretty stagnant space.
Excellent. So, Josh, staying with you, you've talked about some of the ways you've integrated. You've talked about the value of those integrations. What are your customers seeing, right? How are they leveraging your integration with the Autodesk Construction Cloud?
Sure. So I mentioned one kind of surprise use case was this. Clients were so pleased with the integration between the two that they began leveraging the Autodesk Docs interface for consuming document-related data into O3. So that's exciting and an interesting use case. Just because it was so easy, the tools together were so easy to use. That's one that clients found on their own, which I think is a great story. In terms of the reaction is overwhelmingly positive. The majority of our clients are already Autodesk clients. So leveraging the two platforms together is pretty straightforward. And then I would also say that the bar for user experience in our industry has been pretty low for many years, right? And the lack of innovation and stagnancy has been from some of the legacy providers, I think, has been disheartening. But Autodesk doesn't subscribe to that philosophy. O3 does not subscribe to that philosophy. IntelliWave does not subscribe to that philosophy. But it's great to be able to provide these kind of integrated modern solutions that play nice together, that have a logical interface and a good experience. So the clients have been really blown away by the combined solution, and we've been really pleased with the feedback from the field and the value the partnership has brought.
Barry, how about your customers?
Yeah, for sure. I think I would echo Josh's comments. I mean, a lot of our customers are existing Autodesk customers today, and I think the way that they're leveraging our integration in the field is really from a perspective of trying to access that material management data, that asset data, through their kind of core platform. So whether it be through like the partner card on the Insights tab in the ACC side, being able to essentially even have, for example, the ability to connect inventory to engineering requirements, for example. Like we see a lot of customers basically removing communication barriers between, say, like the engineering and the construction team, even simply, streamlining a model review, for example, based on inventory or material status, which, previously would be a meeting, a phone call, a thread of emails, for example. Well, today you're able to just ingest that data into those solutions from SiteSense. And being able to actually have that really saves the folks a lot of time and effort and admin cost as well, right? We're all looking at the labor shortage as well, right? Like, how do we improve productivity in our labor force, especially with the ongoing labor shortage? And I think those reduction in communication gaps and the reduction in admin costs can really save folks a lot of time and effort, I think, across the board, right? And I think the last piece I would mention there, that folks really see a big benefit of utilizing our integration is the verification against purchase orders created on the cost side. You've always got the purchase order. The vendor's pretty great at submitting the invoice, but the actual component of field capture of that delivery verification or goods receipt in the field is generally the most difficult part to capture, right? So if we look at how we fit into the through a match of how we do that with cost module in ACC, basically that field component, the construction teams or the material folks on site, they're really busy. They're managing a lot of different things. They're trying to get trucks offloaded, so on and so forth. The procurement teams that are looking at cost module and ACC aren't chasing them down anymore. They've got the drafted cost payment application, or they've got the drafted expense created on the ACC side. So essentially, they're not having to jump and make a phone call, send an email, those types of things. And if they need to, they can dive into SiteSense for more detail, get the packing slip information, pictures of the delivery, defects, all those types of things. So I think that's the biggest thing that I would say. That really comes out of that, how they're leveraging our integration with ACC today with SiteSense.
Well, guys, I could talk to you for another hour, but I'm looking at the clock, and we're getting close to the end of our allotted time. So, Barry, I'll start with you. What are some of your final thoughts to the audience today about how to effectively use this integrated technology?
For sure, yeah, and I think we definitely fill another hour, but I think just in summary, I think integrations shouldn't be a scary thing. If you're already using construction-based, cloud SaaS solutions like Josh mentioned and Chuck mentioned, I mean, from that perspective, challenge your software vendors. I would say, from that perspective, I think leveraging the ability to integrate these tools together, kind of challenges that problem I mentioned around the 96% of the data goes unused. Well, if you can connect your ecosystem of tools together, that becomes a thing of the past, right? And if you can, it's hard to even quantify the amount of time and money savings, for example, from a cost perspective, on how much you would actually leverage these integrations and this data, what that could actually do for your business as a 2022 innovation goal, and how you want to get to your objectives from that perspective. So in summary, challenge your vendors, get your ecosystem connected through integrations, and reach out to Josh, myself, and Chuck to learn more about that.
Josh, I know you have thoughts.
Yeah. I would say, I guess first, I just, we really enjoyed, working with the Autodesk team, very knowledgeable and helpful in this process. I think we were able to get our first proof of concept of the integration done in a few hours. Having established APIs and resources and documentation is really important, and that's been great. And I think the most important thing for us is that Autodesk shares this belief in a best-in-breed platform approach to providing technology. So use the best engineering authoring tools for the project, the correct ones for the project. Use the best AWP solution, document management solutions, materials management solutions, even though Autodesk Construction Cloud may have some of those capabilities. In document management, for example, Autodesk understands that some people have embedded document management system tools, and we need to play nice in that environment. We're taking a platform approach, and the important piece is connecting that data across. So I think that's really important, because I think people are done accepting subpar tool performance in the interest of interoperability. They want the ability to select the best in breed tools and connect them all together and have them work nicely.
Right.
That's O3's vision. That's Autodesk's vision. It's been I think that's IntelliWay's vision, and Autodesk has been a great partner in helping us to realize that.
Excellent. Josh and Barry, thank you so much for the time today. I really appreciate you giving the time. To our audience, I pulled a few things out of here that I'd like to summarize with. It really is all about connected data. And you heard both Josh and Barry talk about it, and I even went back and asked them some more. It's really about thinking of your projects as an ecosystem. No one lives on an island. Everybody interacts with each other. You really have to think about your projects as an ecosystem. The pandemic really drove that home for us. It made us all think about collaboration, because as Barry said, suddenly we couldn't live with the file cabinet sitting by our desk. But Josh, you said something and I thought was really interesting. Through this idea of an ecosystem approach and collaborating together, you're really now unlocking the data that used to be trapped inside of these systems by leveraging the Autodesk Construction Cloud. And in the end, it's really all about this idea of best-in-breed solutions. So I started today by asking you a question, and that was the question I'm going to finish this webcast with today. After hearing from Barry and Josh and how they've driven their applications forward by integrating with the Autodesk Construction Cloud, I'll ask you one more time, what is your new possible? Thank you very much for joining us today. We look forward to talking to you on LinkedIn. Have a good day.